The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the ceiling fan, its rhythmic whispers doing little to calm the storm within me. I sat on the edge of the bed, my fingers tracing the embroidered patterns on the quilt absent-mindedly. The weight in, my chest felt immovable, as though my rib cage were caving in under the enormity of the betrayal. I had replayed that moment in my mind 1,000 times since. The moment I found the text messages on her phone, a flurry of flirtation and secrets. Each word a knife slicing through the fabric of the life we'd built. And then the name at the top of the screen. Alex. My stepbrother. The betrayal wasn't just hers. It was his, too. A double-edged treachery that cut deeper than I'd thought possible. I closed my eyes, willing the anger and disbelief to dissipate. But the memory refused to be erased. It was the way she avoided my gaze when I confronted her, her hands trembling as she fumbled for words. Her usual confidence, charming, steady, crumbled into a heap of excuses and stammered half-truths. It was a mistake, she had said, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I didn't mean for this to happen. Please, just let me explain. Her words bounced off me, hollow and meaningless. Didn't mean for this to happen? How does one not mean to betray their spouse? I had paced the room like a caged animal, my fists clenching and unclenching, at my sides. The room seemed smaller, suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in to witness my humiliation. Explain? Explain what, exactly? My voice was sharp, trembling with barely restrained fury. That you slept with him? That you destroyed this marriage for what? A fleeting moment of excitement? She flinched, her face pale. It wasn't like that. Alex and I, it just happened. Those words, it just happened. As if this monumental betrayal could be chalked up to an accident, an errant slip of fate. Alex had been family, or at least he was supposed to be. My father had married his mother when I was 12, blending our two households into a chaotic, imperfect semblance of a family. Alex was older, charismatic, always the center of attention. I'd looked up to him once, despite his flaws. His impulsiveness, his tendency to charm his way out of accountability. And now he'd charmed his way into my wife's bed. The next revelation had been the cruelest blow. She was pregnant. The air had left my lungs when she told me, her voice breaking under the weight of the admission. I don't know who the father is, she'd confessed, her hands clutching her stomach as though trying to shield the life growing within her from the chaos she'd unleashed. The irony was sickening. For months we had tried for a child, each negative test a shared disappointment. And now, when it finally happened, the joy was tainted, stolen by the uncertainty of its origin. I told her parents 2 days later. Not out of malice, but because I couldn't carry the burden alone any longer. They deserved to know, I reasoned. They needed to understand why their son-in-law, the man who had adored their daughter, was unraveling before their eyes. The memory of that confrontation is etched into my mind. Her father, a stoic man of few words, had sat silently at the kitchen table, his jaw tight, his hands clasped together in front of him. Her mother, usually warm and effusive, had gasped in disbelief, her hand flying to her mouth as though to stifle a scream. Is this true? Her father had asked, his voice low and trembling with restrained emotion. His gaze was fixed on her, searching for answers she couldn't give. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice cracking. I didn't mean for this to... He held up a hand to silence her, his expression hardening. Don't say it didn't mean to happen. You made choices. You betrayed not just him, but all of us. As I sat there in that quiet room, the weight of the past weeks pressing down on me, I realized something. The pain, the anger, the betrayal, they weren't going to vanish. But neither was I. This was my story, my life, and I wasn't going to let their actions define it. The road ahead was murky, filled with uncertainty. There were decisions to be made, battles to fight, and wounds that would take time, perhaps a lifetime, to heal. But one thing was clear. I was stepping out of the shadows of their betrayal and into the light of my own resolve, and I wasn't looking back. The days after I told her parents felt like trudging through quicksand. Every step forward felt labored, weighed down by the suffocating reality of what had unfolded. I kept my distance from her and Alex, retreating into my own space, needing time to process. She stayed with her parents for the time being, leaving the house eerily silent, as though the walls themselves mourned the absence of the life we once had. One evening, as I sat on the couch nursing a glass of whiskey, my phone buzzed on the table. Alex's name glared back at me, the glow of the screen almost taunting. My thumb hovered over the answer button, indecision twisting in my gut. Finally, I answered, my voice cold. "What do you want?" There was a pause. Then his voice came through, hesitant. I need to talk to you, face to face." I scoffed, the sound bitter even to my own ears. "What could you possibly have to say to me, Alex? Haven't you done enough?" "Please," he said, his voice quieter now. "I owe you an explanation. Just give me a chance to explain." Part of me wanted to hang up, to deny him the satisfaction of clearing his conscience. But another part, the part still desperate for closure, for answers, relented. "Tomorrow," I said, the words sharp. "At the park near the old library, noon. Don't be late." The next day, the park was bathed in the muted gold of winter sunlight. The trees were skeletal, their bare branches reaching skyward like silent witnesses to what was about to unfold. I stood near a bench, hands stuffed into the pockets of my jacket, my breath visible in the crisp air. Alex arrived a few minutes later, his usually confident stride subdued. He wore a heavy coat, his hands jammed into his pockets, his face a mixture of regret and apprehension. He stopped a few feet away, unsure if he should come closer. I gestured to the bench. "Sit." He obeyed, lowering himself onto the bench with a sigh. For a moment we sat in silence, the sounds of distant laughter from children playing on the swings filling the void between us. "I messed up," he finally said, his voice heavy. "I know that." I turned to him, my gaze hard. "That's the understatement of the century. You didn't just mess up, Alex. You betrayed me. You betrayed family. What kind of person does that?" He flinched, his jaw tightening. "You're right. I don't have an excuse. It was selfish, and it was wrong." "Selfish?" I echoed, the word bitter on my tongue. "Do you even understand the damage you've done? To me, to her, to this family?" He looked down, his hands clasping and unclasping as though searching for something to hold on to. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I want you to know that it wasn't planned. We never set out to hurt you. It spiraled out. Of control?" "Spiraled out of control?" I shook my head, laughing bitterly. "You make it sound like some accident. Do you have any idea how ridiculous that sounds? You made choices, Alex. Deliberate, conscious choices." His face crumpled, and for the first time, I saw genuine remorse in his eyes. "I wish I could take it all back," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I hate myself for what I've done to you." I studied him, searching his face for sincerity. There was regret there, sure, but regret wasn't enough. It wouldn't erase the betrayal, wouldn't heal the wounds left in its wake. "Regret doesn't change anything," I said finally, my voice steady. "It doesn't undo the damage. It doesn't erase the pain." The conversation ended with no resolution, no closure. He left the park with his head bowed, and I remained on the bench, staring out at the empty playground. The weight in my chest was still there, but it felt different now, less suffocating, more manageable. I had faced him. I had said my piece. And though it didn't change the past, it felt like a step forward. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I thought about her, about the child she carried. A part of me wanted to walk away, to leave it all behind and start over. But another part, quieter but insistent, reminded me of the vows we'd made, of the life we'd built together. I didn't have all the answers yet. But I knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened next, it would be on my terms. I would reclaim my life, piece by piece, and rebuild it into something stronger. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope, and that, I realized, was a beginning. The days that followed were a slow, deliberate process of navigating through the wreckage. Every conversation we had felt like a delicate negotiation. Each word weighed with meaning, each silence stretched thin with the tension of the past. I could see the effort she was making, the way she was trying to rebuild the pieces of what she had broken. But there was something in me that couldn't quite let go of the feeling that we had already been lost. Lost in ways that no effort could reverse. She was different now, more quiet, more contemplative. She seemed to be constantly watching me, as if waiting for a reaction to each of her actions. Her eyes would linger on me, searching, as if looking for a sign that I was still here, still with her. It felt strange, this new version of her, more fragile, less certain. The woman who had once been so bold and confident now moved through the house as though treading on broken glass. And I wasn't sure what to feel. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to be furious at her for doing this, for betraying me in such a fundamental way. But I also couldn't deny the love that still simmered beneath the surface. It was tangled up with resentment, guilt, and confusion, but it was still there, like a faint ember waiting for a breath of wind to ignite it. One evening, about a week after she'd returned, I found her in the kitchen, her back to me as she stirred something in a pot on the stove. She didn't hear me approach, and for a moment, I just stood there, watching her. The soft curve of her back, the way her hair cascaded in loose waves over her shoulders, the quiet concentration on her face. It was a scene I had seen countless times before, but tonight it felt different, haunted, as though the image of her was already beginning to slip away from me, fading like a dream upon waking. "You're still here," she said softly, breaking the silence without turning around. I felt my heart tighten. "Yeah, I'm still here." She exhaled slowly, and I could hear the hesitation in her voice when she spoke again. "I know it's hard. I know I don't deserve a second chance, but I just need you to know how sorry I am. I wish I could make it right. I wish I could take back everything that's happened." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stepped closer, watching her as she continued stirring the pot, her movements robotic, as if she were trying to focus on something, anything, other than the weight of her words. "I don't know how to fix this," I said quietly, my voice heavier than I meant it to be. "I don't know if I even want to fix it. It's not just you, it's everything. I don't know how to move past this." Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time in weeks, I saw her break. The walls she'd carefully built around herself crumbled in a single silent moment. She turned toward me then, her eyes red-rimmed, her face streaked with tears. "I know I've lost you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't take back what I've done, but I can promise you that I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be the woman you deserve, if you'll let me." I felt my chest tighten as I watched her stand there, raw and exposed in front of me. There was a part of me that wanted to reach out, to comfort her, to tell her that everything would be okay. But I couldn't. Not yet. Not when the wounds were still so fresh, so open. I don't know if I can let you back in, I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. But I can't walk away either. She nodded, her expression pained but understanding. I don't expect you to forgive me. Not yet. But I'll be here, whenever you're ready, for whatever you need. The days turned into weeks, and, still, nothing changed. We existed in the same space, but it felt like we were living in parallel worlds, each of us carrying our own burdens. We spoke less and less, and when we did, the conversations were short, hollow. I would watch her at times, and I could see the deep exhaustion in her eyes, the regret, the guilt. But there was also something else, a quiet resilience, a determination to make things right, even if it took a lifetime. She never pushed, never demanded. She was waiting for me to make the choice, to choose if this broken marriage could be repaired. I spent a lot of time thinking. I'd go on long walks trying to clear my head, trying to find some clarity. I could feel myself on the edge of something, but I couldn't tell what it was. My heart still ached with the memory of her betrayal. But there was also an undeniable truth. We were about to bring a child into this world. That was the one thing that kept me grounded, the one thing that tethered me to the reality of our situation. One night, as I sat on the couch, the sound of her voice, soft, tentative, pulled me out of my thoughts. I've been thinking, she said, her words hesitant, as though she were testing the waters. About the baby. About what we're going to do when it comes. The days that followed our conversation felt like a quiet truce between us. There were no grand declarations, no sudden shifts in our relationship. It was all small gestures, unspoken, tentative attempts to rebuild a foundation that had been cracked and splintered by betrayal. There was no grand resolution, no moment of perfect clarity. We just existed side by side, moving through the motions, feeling the weight of everything we couldn't say. Her presence in the house had become both a comfort and a constant, reminder of everything that had happened. I would catch glimpses of her in the kitchen, preparing meals, her movements slow and thoughtful, as if she were lost in the process. I watched her from a distance, unsure of how to interact, unsure of how to be around her without the old bitterness creeping back into my thoughts. Sometimes, I would see the way her hand lingered on her stomach, as though she were silently reassuring herself that this baby, our baby, was real, and that it was something we both had to face, no matter how fractured we had become. I was still uncertain about what came next. The idea of her carrying our child, of watching her bring a life into this world, left me with a complex mix of emotions. There was a small part of me that wanted to be the man she had once loved, to wrap my arms around her and tell her that everything would be okay. But there was another part of me, a deeper part, that remained cold and distant. The memory of her. Betrayal was still too fresh, too raw. How could I trust her again? I spent more time in my study, poring over old records, trying to distract myself with anything that required focus. But the constant thought of the baby, our baby, would never leave my mind. Sometimes I would feel a wave of warmth, of responsibility, of connection. Other times, the overwhelming feeling of anger would surge up again, and I would have to force it down, like a stone sinking in the pit of my stomach. It was a Thursday evening when it happened. We had barely spoken all day, each of us busy with our own tasks, each of us retreating into our own corners of the house. I had just come downstairs after a long, silent evening in my study. She was sitting on the couch in the living room, her legs tucked beneath her, a book open in her lap. But her gaze was distant, unfocused. She looked up as I entered, but there was no immediate warmth in her expression, no indication that things had changed. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly, her voice soft, almost tentative. The tone was different from the usual distance between us. It felt more like an invitation, like she was reaching out across the space that had grown between us. I hesitated, my feet still frozen in the entryway. The air felt thick, heavy with the things we hadn't said. And yet, something in her expression, the way she was holding herself, made me feel that this conversation was going to be different. Something was about to shift. I nodded, but I couldn't bring myself to sit. Instead, I stayed standing, my hands in my pockets, the tension in my body evident. She looked up at me, her eyes searching mine for something. Understanding, forgiveness, maybe even just acknowledgement. I wasn't sure what she wanted from me, but I knew that I couldn't give it to her. Not yet. "I've been thinking," she started, her voice wavering slightly. "About everything. About us. About what happened." I stayed silent, waiting for her to continue. I wasn't sure I was ready for her to explain, not ready to hear her recount the betrayal again, but I knew I had to listen. We had to talk about it, or we would never move past it. "I know I can't change what happened," she continued, her eyes dropping to her hands, twisting together in her lap. "I don't even know if you'll ever be able to forgive me. But I want to try. I want to do whatever it takes to fix this, not for the baby, not for anyone else, but for us." I exhaled sharply, my heart pounding in my chest. "It's not just about us, though. It's about everything. It's about trust. It's about what you did." Her face tightened, and for a brief moment I saw a flicker of shame in her eyes. She looked like she was going to speak, but then she hesitated, as though carefully choosing her words. "I can't undo it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I know that. But I need you to know that I'm not that person anymore. I don't want to be. I don't want to lose you." The vulnerability in her words caught me off guard, and for a fleeting moment, I felt the anger wane. It was still there, lurking, but it wasn't all-consuming like it had been. Instead, a quieter kind of sadness filled its place. A realization that we were both adrift in this new reality, unsure of what to do, but unwilling to give up entirely. "I don't know if I can trust you again," I said, the words coming out more softly than I intended. "But I'm not ready to walk away either." The weeks that followed were a fragile balancing act, a delicate choreography between what we had been and what we were trying to become. It wasn't easy. It wasn't a smooth transition from the past to the future, but instead a series of moments, small, tentative steps taken in the hope of something resembling healing. Our conversations became longer, though still filled with hesitations. There were no grand gestures, no sweeping declarations of love. Instead, it was about learning to be present again, to be in the same space without the heavy weight of silence hanging over us. She'd catch my gaze across the room, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth, but it never quite reached her eyes. It was as if she was still waiting for something, waiting for me to give her a sign, a signal that I was truly here, that I had forgiven her. And I wasn't sure if I had. Forgiveness wasn't something I could just hand out like it was a simple commodity. It wasn't something I could fake, something I could pretend to give when the truth of my feelings was still tangled in anger and confusion. One evening, I found myself sitting on the porch, watching the sunset bleed across the horizon, the colors soft and melting into each other. The cool air brushed against my skin, the stillness of the world around me offering a moment of clarity. I had been here before in this same chair, with the same view, with her beside me, talking about everything and nothing at all. But now, it felt different. The quiet between us wasn't comforting. It wasn't easy. And then she appeared in the doorway, standing there for a moment before taking slow, measured steps toward me. Her figure was framed by the soft light of the house, and I could see the hesitation in her posture, the way she was almost holding herself back. She didn't speak immediately. She just stood there, her eyes locked on mine. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if the words might shatter if spoken too loudly. "About the baby and about us." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I turned my gaze back to the horizon, the familiar scenery now feeling like an anchor that kept me from falling into the depths of everything I couldn't say. "Are you happy?" she asked after a beat, her words unexpected. And they made me pause, made me reconsider the question in a way I hadn't before. "I mean, truly happy? Do you think we can be happy again?" I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of her question settle deep in my chest. It wasn't just the pregnancy. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was everything. How we had drifted so far apart. How we had become strangers even in the moments when we were close. Could we really find our way back? "I don't know," I said, the honesty in my voice raw, almost painful. "I don't know if we can be happy again, but I do know that we're here, and I don't want to walk away. Not from you, not from this." Her breath caught, and for a moment I could see her fight to keep the tears at bay. She sat down beside me, close but not too close, as if testing the boundaries that had once been so fluid between us. There was a heavy silence, one filled with so many unsaid things, so many emotions that we had yet to voice. "I don't deserve this," she whispered, her words so quiet I almost missed them. "I don't deserve your patience. I don't deserve your willingness to try." I turned toward her then, my heart beating faster, the vulnerability in her voice breaking something inside me. "You're right. You don't deserve it. But I don't know what else to do. I don't know how to fix this, but I'm here. I'm trying." Her hand brushed against mine, and for a moment I felt a rush of warmth, a flash of what we had been before. It was fleeting, but it was there. An echo of the love we once shared, of the possibility that it could exist again. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I'm scared that I've ruined everything, that no matter what I do, I'll never be enough to make up for what happened." I looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the weight of her fear, her regret, the way it wore on her like an invisible cloak. And in that moment I realized something. We both were scared. We were both walking through the remnants of our past, afraid that we wouldn't find a way to rebuild, that we wouldn't be able to create something new from the ruins. But there was something else, too. There was hope. "I'm scared, too," I said quietly. "Scared that I'll never be able to forgive you. Scared that I'll never be able to trust you the way I did before." She nodded, her expression one of understanding. "I don't expect you to trust me right away. I know it'll take time. But I'll wait. I'll wait however long it takes." The honesty between us was raw, and the words we spoke were imperfect, but they were all we had. It wasn't the solution, it wasn't the perfect resolution, but it was a step forward. Together. The days that stretched ahead began to blend together, marked only by the quiet rhythms of our existence, measured by the sound of my footsteps across the house, by the subtle changes in the way she carried herself, by the soft glow of the night. As we both retreated to our separate corners of the home, trying to balance what we once had and what we could yet become. It was an odd kind of peace, uncertain and fragile, but it was all we had, all we could give each other. I watched her, more closely now, her movements, the way she placed a hand on her stomach as though cradling the weight of what was to come, the careful way she spoke when we did talk, as though treading on glass, fearing that any wrong word could shatter whatever was left of us. There were still days when I found myself sinking into that well of bitterness, when the memories of what she had done, the feeling of betrayal that had once been so all-consuming, would rise up like a wave, drowning me in its bitterness. I would turn away, retreating into myself again, but she always tried. Sometimes, late at night, When the house was quiet and the only sound was the soft rustling of the wind outside, I would hear her moving about in the kitchen, preparing something for herself, or maybe for both of us. The clink of dishes, the slow, deliberate sound of a knife cutting through vegetables, would be the only noise. But I found myself listening. And when she would return to sit beside me, her presence no longer felt like a shadow or an intrusion, but a quiet weight that reminded me of everything we'd once been. I was trying, but was I really? One afternoon, weeks into this tentative cohabitation, we found ourselves sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where we had shared so many meals, so many quiet moments before everything had changed. She was visibly pregnant now, her belly, round and unmistakable. Her face had softened over the months, less tense, though the undercurrent of guilt still lingered in her eyes. She didn't talk much about the pregnancy, not unless I asked. And even then, her answers were careful, guarded. "I've been thinking about names," she said, breaking the silence. Her voice was light, almost as though she were testing the waters, unsure of how the conversation would be received. "For the baby, I mean." I looked at her, unsure of what to say, unsure of whether to engage. But something about her tone, the way her eyes met mine, searching for a sign of interest, made me lean in. "Names?" I repeated, feeling a knot form in my chest. I had thought about it, of course. How could I not? But actually speaking about it to her, to this life growing inside of her, felt strange, almost surreal. "Yeah," she replied, her fingers brushing over the edge of her glass. "I know it's early, but it's something I've been thinking about. I want the baby to have something that represents hope, something new, something we can both start fresh with." Her words cut through the air, and I felt the weight of them, the hope she was speaking of, the kind I wasn't sure I had anymore. Could I really see this child as a new beginning for us? Could I move past everything that had happened, all the pain, the betrayal, and try to build something better? "I don't know," I said finally, my voice quieter than I meant it to. It's hard for me to think about names when I can't even figure out how to fix what's broken between us." She was silent for a moment, and then she spoke, her voice steady despite the heaviness of the subject. "I don't want you to fix everything at once. I just want us to be okay, to find a way forward. Not for the baby, not because we have to, but because we can." I nodded, but it didn't feel like enough. We couldn't just move forward by pretending things were fine. It wasn't that simple. I knew that. But could we work through it? Could we learn to rebuild trust, piece by fragile piece? Before I could respond, there was a knock at the door, loud and sudden, interrupting our fragile moment. We both looked. Up in unison, the shift in our energy immediate, like a crack in the carefully constructed bubble we'd been living in. "I'll get it," I said, standing up abruptly. I needed to break the tension, even if only momentarily. The visitor could be anyone, someone from her family, a friend, or even just a neighbor. But when I opened the door, I found something entirely different. My stepbrother, Ryan, stood on the other side, his expression unreadable. He was dressed in dark jeans and a simple shirt, but there was an intensity to his gaze that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It had been months since I'd seen him, since the night everything had exploded, since the day I'd learned what had happened between him and her. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I couldn't decipher the look in his eyes, something between guilt and defiance. It was as though he was waiting for something. Ryan stepped inside, his presence filling the room in a way that felt too big, too charged for the quiet atmosphere we'd tried to maintain. He didn't look around the house, didn't make any effort to ease the tension. His eyes went straight to her, and for a moment, the world around us held its breath. She stood in the kitchen, leaning slightly against the counter, her arms folded over her chest, her eyes wary. Neither of us moved. There was a heavy silence, the kind that drips with unspoken words and history, thick with the weight of everything we had endured. Ryan took a deep breath, the air around him thick with whatever words he was trying to gather. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his jaw clenched tight as though forcing himself to say something he wasn't sure he was ready to. "I'm sorry," he said, finally breaking the silence. His voice was flat, unsteady. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness or even your attention. But I need you to know that I regret what happened. I regret hurting both of you." I stood still, my muscles tense as the words hung in the air. An apology. A simple, hollow apology. But that wasn't enough, was it? Not for what had happened. Not for the things that couldn't be erased. The trust that could never be restored in a single breath. "What's your point, Ryan?" I asked, my voice steady but cold. "Are you here to apologize because you think it's going to fix everything? Because you think a sorry will erase what happened?" Ryan flinched at my words, but he didn't look away. There was something different about him now. Something raw and vulnerable that I hadn't seen before. It was as though the weight of everything had broken through the walls he'd put up, leaving him exposed. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said, his voice softer this time, almost pleading. "But I need to be honest with both of you. I've been living with this guilt, and I've been thinking about what I've done. And it's eating me up. I've hurt you both in ways I can't take back. I need to make it right." Her eyes locked on his now, and for the first time since his arrival, I saw something shift in her expression. Her shoulders sagged as though a weight had settled in her chest, something heavy and impossible to shake. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but the words seemed stuck, lodged somewhere between regret and confusion. "I don't think there's any way to make this right," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Not after everything. Not after what you did." Ryan nodded, his face drawn with regret. I know that. I don't have any excuses. But I want to make it right. For you. For me. For everyone I've hurt." The room seemed to shrink around us, the air thick with tension and unspoken truths. I could feel the heat of the moment. The way his words were meant to be some sort of salvation, but they weren't. They couldn't be. They could never be enough to undo the damage, to undo the betrayal, to undo what had shattered between us. Her voice cracked as she finally spoke, her words barely audible. "What about me? What about what I've done?" I turned to her, my heart aching as I watched the rawness of her emotions play out on her face. She had never really allowed herself to acknowledge the depth of her own guilt, her own shame. She'd been hiding it from me, from herself, all this time, pretending that everything could somehow be mended without truly confronting what she had done. But now, it was all spilling out. "I know what I did was unforgivable," she said, her breath catching. "I know I betrayed you, I betrayed us, and I don't expect you to forget. But I can't live like this anymore, carrying this guilt, this shame, like a weight that never lets me breathe. I need to try to fix it, even if I don't know how." I could feel my anger simmering beneath the surface, rising with every word she said. But I swallowed it down. This wasn't the time to let that anger take over. Not with Ryan standing there, not with the gravity of the situation pressing down on all of us. "You can't fix this," I said, my voice low and measured. "Not just by saying you're sorry. It's going to take more than that. It's going to take time, and even then, I'm not sure what that looks like. I don't know if I can ever trust you the way I did before." She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. The sound of it falling seemed louder than it should have been, an echo in the stillness of the room. She wiped it away quickly, as if embarrassed by it, but the moment lingered. Ryan took a step forward, his gaze shifting between us, as though caught between the two of us, uncertain of where his place was in this fractured world we'd created. I don't expect you to forgive me either. I know I can't just come in here and make everything better. But I don't want to be the person who walked away from this. From both of you. The air felt too tight now. The walls too close. The door clicked shut behind Ryan, the faint echo of it hanging in the air like a final note to a song that had no easy resolution. I stood there, frozen for a moment, as though waiting for something more to happen. Some kind of answer. Some closure. But nothing came. Just the lingering weight of his words and the space they left behind. Her breath was soft, but uneven, as though she had been holding it the entire time he was there. I turned to her, not sure what to say, not sure where to even begin. There was a rawness in her eyes, a mixture of relief and regret that mirrored my own, and I could feel the tension between us like a living thing. "You okay?" I asked, though the question felt small, almost pointless in the face of everything that had just transpired. She looked at me for a long moment, her gaze unreadable, then nodded slowly, her lips barely parting. "I don't know," she whispered. I'm trying. But it's hard, you know? It's like I can't breathe sometimes. Like everything I've done is pressing down on me and I don't know how to make it right." Not for you. Not for me. Not for any of us. Her voice wavered, and I could see the tears threatening to fall again. She was so close to breaking, so close to shattering in front of me. And I knew that pain. I knew it, because I felt it too. "I don't know how to make it right either," I said quietly. "I don't know if we can, or if we even should. But we have to try. We have to find a way to live with it, I guess." She took a slow breath, her hand moving to her stomach, as though to steady herself, to hold on to something, anything that could anchor her in this whirlwind of emotions. The baby. Our baby. What a strange, fragile thread that tied us together now. It was a new life, something untouched by the mistakes of the past, and yet it carried with it all the weight of our mistakes, the burden of everything we had done. "Wrong. I don't want to lose you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want this to be the end. I don't want the baby to grow up in a world where we're broken." The words hung in the air, heavy with all the love, the guilt, the fear that had been building between us for months. I could feel the tug of her words, the longing in her voice. She didn't want this to end, and neither did I. Not really. But how could we fix what was so terribly broken? I stepped toward her, closer than I had been in weeks, and reached out, placing my hand gently over hers where it rested on her stomach. It was warm, and I could feel the soft rise and fall of her breath under my palm. "I don't know if we can go back to what we were," I murmured, my voice thick with emotion, "but I'm willing to try. For us. For the baby. We'll figure this out somehow. We have to." Her lips trembled, and for a moment I thought she might pull away from me. But instead she leaned into my touch, her forehead resting lightly against my chest as she closed her eyes, her breath warm against my skin. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry for everything. I've ruined everything, and I don't know how to fix it." I shook my head gently, brushing my fingers through her hair in a quiet gesture of comfort. "You didn't ruin everything," I said softly. "We've both made mistakes. But that doesn't mean it's over. It just means we have to work through it. Together." For a long time, we stood there like that, suspended between the past and the future, both of us clinging to the fragile hope that we could find a way to heal. There were no promises, no guarantees, just the certainty that we were still here, still together. And that was something worth holding on to. "I don't know how long it's going to take," I added quietly, pulling back just enough to look into her eyes. But we'll figure it out. One day at a time. Her eyes were wet with tears, but she smiled, a soft, broken smile that was somehow beautiful in its vulnerability. "I hope so," she whispered. "I really hope so." The weight of everything we had been through pressed heavily on my chest. But in that moment, as we stood there, trying to find our way back to each other, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Not the kind that comes easily or that promises everything will be perfect, but the kind that comes from accepting where we were, from knowing that we had something worth fighting for, and so we did. We fought, quietly, patiently, carefully, for what we had left, for the life growing inside her, for the pieces of us that were still whole, even if broken in places. One day at a time. One moment at a time, trying to build something new from the ruins. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick. But sometimes the most fragile things, the ones built from the most fragile foundations, are the ones that endure the longest. I didn't know what the future held for us, but I knew one thing for sure. We were still here, and that was a start. The days that followed felt like a slow, deliberate unraveling of everything we had once known. Each morning I woke with a sense of heaviness that seemed to sink deeper with every passing hour. It was the weight of our shared history, of the choices we had made, and the consequences we were still facing. But there was also something else there, something tentative and fragile, a flicker of hope that perhaps we could rebuild, piece by broken piece. She and I fell into an uneasy rhythm, learning to navigate the jagged edges of what we'd become. We didn't speak much about the past. The unspoken truth hung over us like a shadow, but neither of us knew how to put it into words without opening wounds that were still too raw to touch. Instead, we focused on the future, on the life inside her. We went to appointments, we talked about names, we made small plans for the future as if everything was normal. But it never felt normal. I'd catch her looking at me sometimes, her expression unreadable, and I'd wonder what was going through her mind. The guilt in her eyes hadn't disappeared, and neither had the fear. She still held herself back, as if afraid to be fully present, as though a part of her was waiting for me to push her away again. And then there were the moments when she'd reach out to me, moments when her touch would be soft and tentative, as if she was testing the waters, unsure of where we stood. She'd hold my hand during dinner or rest her head against my shoulder as we sat together in the quiet of the evening, the silence between us both a comfort and a challenge. Her presence was a reminder of everything we'd been through, and yet I couldn't bring myself to pull away. The baby was growing, its small movements sometimes sending ripples of emotion through both of us. It was strange. This life that was both a blessing and a constant reminder of the fracture between us. We talked about it, of course, about how we'd raise it, what kind of parents we wanted to be. But there was always an underlying tension, a deep, unspoken fear that we wouldn't be able to give this child the stability it deserved. One evening after a long day, we sat on the couch in the dim light of the living room, the TV off, the house quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the background. I felt the weight of her body next to mine, the warmth of her hand resting lightly on my leg, and for a moment it almost felt like before. Almost. She turned to me then, her gaze serious but soft. "Do you think we'll ever be okay?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. "I mean, really okay. Not just pretending for the baby, not just going through the motions, but okay?" I paused, my chest tight as I looked at her. I didn't have an answer, not a clear one. The question had been haunting me for days, ever since Ryan's visit. It had been easier to bury it, to keep pretending that everything could just fix itself, but now that she had asked, I knew we couldn't ignore it any longer, not if we were going to move forward. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if we'll ever go back to how we were. I don't think I can erase the things that happened. But I think maybe we can find a new way forward. Maybe we'll never be the same, but that doesn't mean we can't still build something. For the baby. For us. I don't know how yet." Her lips trembled, and I could see the tears threatening to fall again. She wiped them away quickly, as if ashamed of them, but I could feel the weight of her emotions pressing down on her. We had both carried this burden for so long, in silence, pretending it wasn't there, that it hadn't broken something inside both of us. But the truth was that it had, and we couldn't pretend any longer. "We're not the same," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm not the same person I was before everything happened. And I don't think you are either. But that doesn't mean we're lost. Does it?" I shook my head slowly, my hand reaching for hers, gripping it tightly. "No, we're not lost. Not yet." We sat there in silence for a long time, both of us lost in our own thoughts, the weight of the world still pressing down on us, but in a way that felt different now. We weren't rushing to fix everything, to make it better immediately. We were just existing in it, feeling the weight of it, letting it sink in without trying to outrun it. And in that moment, it felt like we were both taking a small, tentative step forward. Not toward some perfect version of us that never existed, but toward something more honest, something broken but real. Maybe it wasn't perfect. Maybe it never would be. But it was ours. The baby kicked again, a soft, rhythmic reminder of the life we had yet to fully embrace, yet to fully understand. I placed my hand on her stomach, feeling the gentle movement. Beneath my palm, and for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the weeks stretched on in a haze of half-formed moments and quiet decisions. It felt as if time itself had slowed, as if it were giving us the chance to figure things out, even though we both knew there would be no easy answers, no shortcuts through the chaos of what had happened. Each day we would wake up, step around the cracks in our relationship, and move forward as best we could, pretending to be whole while slowly piecing ourselves back together. The house, once filled with the rhythm of everyday life, had grown quieter. There were fewer laughs, fewer spontaneous moments of joy. Instead, the silence between us seemed to expand, filling the space with a heaviness that I couldn't quite shake. I'd find myself standing at the kitchen window, staring, out at the garden, lost in thoughts of what had been and what might still be, the memories of the past, of the life we'd built before everything had fallen apart, were still there, haunting me, a reminder of a time when things were simpler, when we were happier. But there was no going back. Not anymore. Some nights, when she thought I wasn't paying attention, I'd catch her gazing at me from across the room. Her eyes would linger, as if she were trying to read me, trying to understand the person I had become. And I'd wonder if she saw anything of the man I had once been, or if all she saw now was a stranger. We didn't talk about Ryan after that night. There was no need to. The damage had been done, and the silence around it felt like a shared understanding. It was as if neither of us could bring ourselves to speak his name, afraid that doing so would make it too real, too impossible to face. Instead, we focused on the present, on the baby, on the future, on everything that was still left to us. I'd catch her rubbing her belly, her fingers tracing the small curves of her skin, as if seeking comfort from the life growing inside her. And sometimes, just sometimes, she would catch my gaze and offer me a small, hesitant smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind me that despite everything, we were still here. We were still trying. One afternoon, as the light filtered in through the curtains, casting long shadows on the floor, she sat across from me at the table. There was something different in her demeanor today, something in her posture, her expression. She had the same tired look she'd had for weeks. But there was also something else, a kind of determination I hadn't seen in her before. It made my heart beat a little faster, as though she was about to say something important. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice steady, but there was an undercurrent of anxiety in it. "About us, about everything." She paused, her gaze drifting to her hands, where she nervously picked at a loose thread on her sleeve. "And I think we need to talk about the future, really talk about it. What happens after the baby comes? What happens if we can't make it work?" The words hit me like a blow, and I could feel the tension in the room thicken. We had been avoiding this conversation for so long, pretending that things would somehow get better on their own, that time would heal all wounds. But the truth was, we were running out of time. The baby was coming, and we couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay, not anymore. I leaned back in my chair, the sound of it scraping against the floor loud in the silence. My mind raced, but my body felt heavy, as if the weight of her question had settled deep in my bones. "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. She met my gaze then, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and resolve. "I'm saying that maybe we need to be honest with each other, about what we want, about what we need, because if we don't, if we keep living like this, pretending that everything will just magically fix itself, we're just going to keep hurting each other. And I don't want that. Not for me. Not for the baby." The weight of her words landed like a stone in my chest. I had known this conversation was coming, knew we couldn't keep avoiding it, but hearing her say it aloud made it feel real, made it impossible to ignore the truth anymore. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "And what do you think we should do?" My voice sounded thick, as if the question itself had taken on a life of its own, a life I wasn't sure I was ready to face. She hesitated, her fingers trembling slightly as they rested on the table. "I don't know," she whispered. I think we need to decide whether we can actually build a future together, or if we're just holding on because we don't know what else to do. I can't keep living in limbo, in this space where everything is uncertain." There it was, the thing I had feared for so long. The realization that, despite everything we had done, despite the attempts to fix things, we were still standing on the edge of something we couldn't control. The days that followed our conversation were filled with quiet reflection. She and I moved through the house, as if we were both trying to tiptoe around the unsaid, as though the weight of that single conversation could be enough to shatter us, if we weren't careful. But there was also something else beneath the surface, a kind of fragile understanding, a shared recognition that we couldn't keep avoiding the truth forever. I found myself waking up earlier than usual, the morning, light streaming through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. The house was always quiet in the mornings, and I liked it that way. The silence felt like a canvas, empty, waiting for something to fill it, waiting for me to make a decision. She was often already awake by the time I entered the kitchen, sitting at the table, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her coffee mug. There was a quiet sadness in her gaze these days, something I hadn't seen in her before, as though the weight of our situation was beginning to settle into her bones, just as it had in mine. We didn't speak much in those mornings. Instead, we went about our routines, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the quiet space between us. But it wasn't the comfortable silence of familiarity. It was the silence of two people who were no longer sure how to be with each other, who no longer knew what to say. Then came the day when we found ourselves sitting in the living room, a soft afternoon light filtering through the blinds. The air felt thick with everything we had been avoiding, and I knew that we couldn't keep dancing around it any longer. The baby was due soon, very soon, and I had no idea how we were going to navigate this new chapter in our lives when we couldn't even figure out the one we were living. "I've been thinking about what you said," I began, my voice sounding foreign in the quiet room. It felt like I was testing the waters, unsure if I was ready to dive in, but knowing there was no other choice. She nodded, her eyes meeting mine with a mix of apprehension and understanding. "What part?" "About making a choice," I said, swallowing the knot that had formed in my throat. "About deciding what we want, not just for the baby, but for ourselves. Because we can't keep pretending. We can't keep living in this limbo." She sighed deeply, a sound of resignation, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes, a rawness I hadn't seen before. "I don't know if I can go back to what we were. I don't know if that's possible," she said softly. "But I don't want to walk away from everything either. I just—" She trailed off, her gaze dropping to her lap. "I just don't know how to fix this? How do we fix something that's so broken?" I felt the weight of her words settle heavily in my chest. How could we fix something that had been shattered so completely? The betrayal, the lies, the shattered trust, it all seemed insurmountable. But as I looked at her, really looked at her, I realized that we weren't talking about fixing what was broken. We were talking about something much harder. We were talking about rebuilding from the ground up. "I don't know if we can go back," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But maybe we don't need to. Maybe we just need to find a new way. Not just for us, but for the baby. For this little life that's coming into the world, I want to try. I want to make something out of the mess we've made." She looked up at me then, her eyes searching mine as if trying to gauge the sincerity of my words. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We just sat there, the weight of what we were saying hanging between us, unsaid but understood. Finally, she nodded slowly, her lips trembling as she spoke. "I don't want to give up, but I can't promise I'll have all the answers. I don't know if we'll ever be the same, but I'm willing to try. For the baby. For us." The words felt like a release, a tentative step forward. We didn't have answers, not yet, and maybe we never would. But at least we were willing to try. At least we were willing to move forward together, even if we had no idea where that would lead. The conversation lingered in the air, a quiet promise between us. And as I sat there with her, I realized that maybe that was all we could do for now. Just try. To face each day. To rebuild from the wreckage of our past, and to be honest about our fears and our hopes. The days passed, and though the silence between us remained, it wasn't quite as suffocating as it had been before. We didn't have all the answers, and we certainly didn't have everything figured out, but we were both willing to keep trying. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy, but it was real. Then one morning I woke to the sound of her voice calling from the hallway. Her voice, soft but tinged with urgency, echoed in the stillness. "Hey, I think it's time." The hospital was a blur of bright lights and sterile smells. We entered, our hands tightly clasped, our hearts racing in sync, but beneath the chaos there was something else, an unspoken understanding between us. We had no idea how the future would unfold, how the pieces of our fractured relationship would settle. But in this moment, as we walked through the doors, we both knew something important. We were doing this together, not as the people we once were, not as the people who had been torn apart by betrayal and loss, but as two people who, despite everything, still cared for each other deeply. The halls felt cold, a stark contrast to the warmth of the life growing inside her. Her hand in mine was the only anchor I had, the only thing that reminded me we weren't entirely lost. Her breathing was shallow, quick, and I could feel the tension in her body, the anxiety wrapped tightly around her like a vice. But her eyes, they were focused, sharp, as though she had already made peace with what was happening, as though this was the one thing she could control in the midst of everything else. I was trying to stay calm, trying to focus on her, to focus on what she needed, but my thoughts kept drifting. moving in all directions at once. The room felt too small, the air too thick. What if we weren't ready? What if we couldn't make it work? What if I couldn't be the man she needed? What if I failed? Her grip tightened around my hand, and I was pulled back to the moment. She was looking at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. "Hey," she whispered, her voice strained. "It's going to be okay. We're going to be okay." Her words were a comfort, but they were also a challenge. Could we really be okay? Could we overcome everything that had come before and build something new? I wasn't sure. But I wasn't going to let go of that hope, not yet. The nurses guided us to a room, the sounds of footsteps and quiet conversations filling the space around us. They instructed her to lie down, to relax as much as she could, but I could see the tension in her face, the way her body was coiled tight, preparing for the pain to come. I stayed beside her, my hand still in hers, offering what comfort I could, but it felt so small against the weight of what we were facing. Minutes stretched into hours, and I watched her with a mixture of awe and helplessness. I wanted to take her pain away, to make everything easier, but all I could do was hold her hand and be there, be present for this moment that would change everything. "I'm scared," she whispered between contractions, her voice breaking, her body trembling. "I know," I said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "I'm scared too, but we're in this together. We'll get through this together." Her eyes met mine then, and for a brief moment, it felt as though everything else, the betrayal, the silence, the confusion, disappeared. It was just the two of us, standing on the edge of something unknown, yet somehow still connected. The weight of the world was there, but it didn't seem as heavy in that moment. As the hours passed, the pain became more intense, more relentless. I could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her body fought against the overwhelming pressure. But she kept going. She kept pushing forward, and each time she squeezed my hand, I felt her strength. It was a quiet kind of strength, the kind that comes not from certainty, but from sheer willpower. She was doing this for us, for the baby, for the future we still hadn't figured out. And then, finally, the moment arrived. The room seemed to hold its breath as the doctor's voice cut through the tension. "It's time," the doctor said. Her face twisted in pain, and I could see the effort it took for her to push through it. It felt as though the whole world was holding its breath along with her, waiting for that one defining moment. I stood by her side, offering her the strength I had left, willing her to keep going. "Come on," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "You can do this. We're almost there." With a final, exhausted push, the baby was born. The cry that filled the room was a sound I will never forget, loud, powerful, and full of life. It was the sound of hope, of new beginnings, of everything we had fought for, everything we had lost, and everything we still had the chance to rebuild. I watched as the nurse placed the tiny bundle in her arms, her face softening as she gazed down at our child, her expression a mix of awe and love. There, in that moment, surrounded by the chaos of the delivery room, something shifted. Something important. The pain, the fear, the uncertainty. It all felt distant now, replaced by this new life, this new purpose. And I realized for the first time in months that maybe we could make it. Maybe we could rebuild. Maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. Not as the people we were, but as the people we were becoming. The hospital room was filled with a soft, almost surreal silence, as we held our child for the first time. It was as though time had slowed down, or perhaps it was simply that the weight of everything that had led us to this moment had finally reached a fragile resolution. I looked at my wife, the woman who had been both my love and my greatest challenge, and I saw her in a new light, her tired, tear-streaked face softened by the smallest hint of a smile as she cradled our baby. There was something about this moment, about the life in her arms, that made all the past pain and uncertainty feel distant. But it wasn't gone. Not yet. I sat beside her, my hand gently resting on the small bundle wrapped in soft hospital blankets, the baby's tiny fingers grasping at the air, reaching for something they couldn't yet understand. I wondered if it was me they were reaching for, whether they would learn to trust me, whether they would come to love me as I loved them. I had no answers, only hope, and the overwhelming desire to do better. "I can't believe she's finally here," my wife whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she looked down at our daughter. She hesitated for a moment, glancing at me, before speaking again. "Do you think we can make this work? What if we can't fix everything?" I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her questions settle heavily in my chest. The truth was, I didn't know. I didn't know if we could ever go back to the way we once were, if the scars of betrayal would ever fully fade. But in that moment, with our baby between us, I couldn't bring myself to voice the doubt that lingered in my mind. Instead, I pressed my lips together and took her hand. "We're already trying," I said softly, "and I think that's enough for now." She nodded, her gaze fixed on our daughter's delicate face, her eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in a long time: hope. It was a fragile thing, that hope, but it was there, like a faint light at the end of a long tunnel. I clung to it as she did, even though the path ahead was far from clear. The hours passed quickly as the newborn rested in her arms, the two of them falling into a quiet rhythm, a bond that transcended everything that had come before. I couldn't help but marvel at how natural it felt, despite everything. Holding our child, watching her sleep, listening to her quiet breaths, it was as though I was witnessing something miraculous, something that made the pain of the past feel distant, even if just for a while. But then, as I watched her, I couldn't ignore the quiet ache that lingered within me. The memories of her betrayal, of the secrets that had been kept, still gnawed at my mind, stirring up old wounds. They were there, just beneath the surface, like hidden thorns in a garden that had been neglected too long. And though I longed to silence them, to let this new chapter be one of peace, I knew that healing would take time, more time than I could predict. "I don't want to keep lying to myself," I murmured, my voice barely audible, "about what happened, about what I'm still feeling." Her eyes flickered up to meet mine, and in that brief exchange, I saw a silent understanding. She wasn't asking for everything to be forgiven in an instant, nor was I. We both knew that the road ahead would be slow, uneven, and painful at times. But that didn't mean we couldn't move forward, together. "I don't expect you to forget or to pretend everything's okay," she said quietly, her voice raw. I want you to know that I'm trying, and I need you to try too, for us, for our daughter." The air between us seemed to thicken as the weight of her words settled in. We weren't going to get over this quickly, nor should we. But the willingness to try, to keep moving forward, to face the mistakes, the fears, the doubts, was something we hadn't had before. It was the one thing that could save us, even when it felt like everything else was slipping through our fingers. The nurse entered then, breaking the moment of quiet between us, her soft voice announcing that it was time to move to a recovery room. We both stood up, carefully handing our daughter over to the nurse, a pang of reluctance tightening my chest as she was whisked away. I didn't want to let go. Not yet. But as we followed the nurse down the corridor, I noticed something new in the way she walked, my wife, that is. There was a kind of quiet strength in her now, a determination I hadn't seen in her before. She wasn't the same woman she had been when she'd walked into this hospital, neither was I. We were both different now, shaped by the trials we had faced, the love we still had for each other, and the responsibility we now carried. As we entered the recovery room and settled into the sterile, white space, I realized that the real work was only just beginning. The questions I had, the fears, the anger, would take time to untangle.